Hi, everyone. Thanks for listening to the Founder Spirit podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Wu. In this podcast series, I'll be interviewing exceptional, unique individuals with the Founder Spirit, ranging from social entrepreneurs, tech founders, to philanthropists, elite athletes, and more. Together, we'll uncover not only how they manage to succeed in face of multiple challenges, but also who they are as people and their human story. Our very special guest today is Heather Ibrahim Leathers, founder and president of the Global Fund for Widows, the world's largest non-for-profit organization dedicated to economically empowering widows in the developing world. With its focus on training and financing widows to build sustainable microenterprises, the Global Fund for Widows has empowered over hundreds and thousands of women and children all over the world. Heather is the leading authority and voice for over 300 million widows, advocating for their human rights at the United Nations, the House of Lords in the UK, as well as the US Congress. For her groundbreaking work and relentless effort of bringing the epidemic of widowhood into the forefront of global consciousness, Heather was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2021. I'm personally very honored and humbled to have you on the show, Heather.
Jen, thank you so much for having me. The honor is mine. I'm the one that's humbled. Thank you.
And my heartfelt congratulations to you on the Nobel Prize nomination, and thank you for taking the time today to join us.
Thank you.
So, Heather, I understand that you founded the Global Fund for Widows 15 years ago, shortly after the passing of your grandmother. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how you come to found such a great organization?
Yeah, I think I didn't really appreciate or understand what I was doing at the time. My background was a 16-year veteran of Wall Street. I had recently retired from Wall Street to raise my children. And I was pregnant with my second child when my grandmother passed away. And around that time, I was about 35 years old. And in my grieving, I realized that she actually had a really difficult life. And in trying to sort of problem solve for that, I realized that all of her troubles began the moment she became a widow. She was disinherited of all of her property, all of the money of the family that she had, even property that she had brought into the marriage as a gift from her own father. And she had 4 children that she needed to care for in Alexandria, Egypt. And she was also young. She was 35 herself when she became a widow. And so I started as a research analyst trying to problem solve for this and trying to understand why is it and how did this happen. And as I researched it, I realized that this is a massive, massive human rights crisis that is operating on an epidemic level, but hasn't entered our global consciousness here on this side of the pond, right? It's pervasive throughout mostly sub-Saharan Africa, but also Northern Africa, all through South Asia, and no one's talking about it. And so with very little understanding of nonprofit work, actually absolutely no understanding of nonprofit work, I decided I would start a small nonprofit just to help a few grandmas in Egypt. And quickly we began to understand that this was going to have to be a massive global effort if we were going to be able to affect real change. And then we realized we really kind of needed to step it up and not just be in Egypt, but become affiliated with the UN in order to address the issue on a macro level.
Heather, you had mentioned the massive human rights crisis that you had uncovered in this process. Can you tell the audience what you mean by the epidemic of widowhood?
Sure. As we started doing the work and going out into the field and meeting widows, we discovered that there are 3 main human rights violations that occur on a massive proportion, and it's actually done with astonishing impunity. The first violation that the widows endure is what I call disinheritance. It's this issue where widows are not able to inherit anything that was rightfully theirs. It could be mutual marital property. Could be their marital home, marital lands, any types of valuable assets, including bank accounts, for example. Oftentimes, widows are also disinherited of things that they brought into the marriage, jewelry, valuable assets. But what was really astonishing to learn with the disinheritance also is that it's linked to algorithms that sometimes mean that the widow can't inherit her own children. And that was something that was a bit of an additional shock to me, because sometimes based on the matrilineage or patrilineage line, either the daughter or the son may have a greater share in the inheritance. And so the husband's family will hold on to that child in order to be able to hold on to most of the estate. The other thing that happens with widows is that sometimes they're treated as property themselves and are inherited themselves to their husband's next of kin. So if you think about it, if there was a dowry paid for that woman, maybe 4 cows, the family is out 4 cows. In their mind, they've paid for her. So if the husband suddenly dies, the family still thinks that she belongs to the family because she was worth 4 cows. And so then she's married off to the husband's brother, the husband's father, or some other cousin in order to preserve the marital property and to preserve that wealth within the family. So that was the shock of disinheritance. And this occurs with impunity. The other form of human rights violations that I uncovered was what I call discrimination. And I'm not talking about the way that people treat each other on the street. I'm talking about institutionalized policies, laws that actually discriminate against a widow and somehow prevent her from inheriting, which 39 countries on the planet today actually prevent a widow from inheriting, or make it very difficult for the widow to inherit because of various loopholes or various inconsistencies in policies. And that's about 102 countries, believe it or not, continued throughout the world today that prevent a widow from inheriting. One of the things that I witnessed myself in the field when I was in Egypt was that a widow would love to have a microloan in order to start a small business. And again, remember, most widows were widowed under the age of 39, which invariably means that they are mothers of young children. And on average, it's about 5 children per widow. So they go into survival mode. They need to survive, especially when they've been disinherited. And so the next best thing is to start a small business in order to feed and educate their children. Well, what happens is that microfinance companies will come along and say, oh, sure, we're totally happy to give you a microloan. Where's your collateral? And the widow will say, I don't have collateral because I was disinherited. I have nothing. Oh, okay, no problem. Well, where's your cosigner? You need a guarantor, and in our country, that has to be a man. Well, I don't have a male cosigner because my husband is deceased and my father-in-law wanted to marry me. And so that institutionalized discriminatory policy puts these widows into a doom loop, essentially. And it really kind of launches the vicious cycle of poverty almost immediately. The last thing that we uncovered is probably the most tragic. It's what we call harmful traditional practices, or HTPs. Harmful traditional practices are culturally mandated and culturally endorsed forms of violence against women. And these types of violence take multiple forms and really occur with impunity, real impunity. This is ubiquitous. And this type of abuse, just say for the sake of the podcast, that it's sexual violence, and we've seen it on so many levels. It could be one time, it could be multiple, it could be one individual, it could be gang related, it could happen over the course of many years. It's preposterous and it's sad. The widow is blamed for being the curse upon the man. And the members of the community, especially the family, are seeking to basically cleanse the widow's somehow blame and shame her into disappearing, because that's generally what happens when you perpetrate violence against women. And these three forms of human rights violations, when you think about the implications, they're really driving us away from all of the SDGs. If you disinherit a widow, overnight she becomes impoverished. And as she becomes impoverished, she can no longer attain basic needs, which means immediately she cannot afford food. So that's SDG 1 now, and SDG 2, no hunger. She can't afford health care, that's SDG 3. She can't afford education of her children, that's SDG 4. What will she do when her kids come out of school? Well, the first thing that she'll do, and they tell us this every single day, she'll surrender her daughter to child marriage, SDG 5. What happens to the sons? Well, then they're recruited by extremists or criminal gangs. That's SDG 8, I believe. So you'll see that we've moved away from 6 SDGs by the simple act of disinheritance. And that's what we call the epidemic of widowhood.
As you mentioned, you had a very successful career on Wall Street prior to founding the Global Fund for Widows, where you won the coveted Institutional Investor Award for your research on Brazilian banks, if I remember. It doesn't sound like a very easy decision to me to go from being a banker on Wall Street to founding a non-for-profit. What was going through your head at the time? I know you were raising children at the time, too.